Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Everywhere except for China if you're LeBron James and the NBA. Yes, the story that will not die continues to plague the NBA. This time LeBron James said, "Adam Silver, hold my beer." It's 5 o'clock Central Time, Saturday afternoon, and that means one thing and one thing only. You're listening to the host with the most numbers right here on MoJo 50 Radio. I'm Andrew Coppens, and this year's show is Critical Thinking. You can find me on the socials at The Coppens Show. That's C-O-P-P-E-N-S, C-O-P-P-E-N-S, for those of you who are new to the show. If you are, thank you so much for listening. If you are listening, you can do so live each and every week on iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and MoJo50.com. But if you're into the visualization of the show, you can head over to the MoJo 50 Radio Facebook page. See this show airing live every Saturday afternoon for your viewing pleasure. Whatever shall we be talking about today? Well, obviously, we're going to be talking about the latest in the whole NBA China human rights scandal. We're going to be talking about the Chicago Teachers Union going on strike and why you in the rest of America, whether you live in a town of 200 people or a city of 3 million, should be paying attention. And to help me bring that point home, I will be bringing back Miley Smith of IllinoisPolicy.org to talk to us about the latest ongoings in the strike that is now well into its second or third day. And we're also going to be talking about, well, the fourth of the who could be the most socialist, democratic debate. So let's just get into some critical thinking. All right, folks. First up, we have got to talk about this whole entire fourth debate for the Democrats on Tuesday night. No, you're not going to hear, did you hear what this person said? And did you hear about that spat? And all of those types of things. That's not what we do here on Critical Thinking. But the themes of that debate are what's important. And for me, there was one theme that really stuck out, and that was the quote-unquote debate around this idea of the wealth tax. And it left me with this question. What is the left's obsession with the wealth tax and wealth inequality? And I'm going to get into this in 3 different ways here. First off, I want to get into the idea of what the wealth tax is and it being American by nature. I also want to talk about the shrinking middle class and that whole mythology. And most importantly, what does the Constitution tell us about a wealth tax? Interestingly, though, folks, even before this debate happened on Tuesday, I was already preparing to do something on this idea of the wealth tax because there was a recent op-ed in the New York Times by David Leonard who brought this to my attention, as he claims the rich really do pay lower taxes than you or I do. Now, from this article, what Leonard says is, for the first time on record, the 400 wealthiest Americans last year paid a lower tax rate, spending federal, state, and local taxes than any other income group, according to newly released data. Now, it's important to understand that that data comes from 2 people, economist Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, who, oh, by the way, also happen to be informing, educating, and being a part of Elizabeth Warren's entire campaign. They're forming the basis of her economic policy. How could it be possible that the 400 wealthiest Americans last year paid a lower tax rate, spending federal, state, and local taxes than any other income bracket? Well, there are a couple of things at work. First off, there was a lowering of the estate tax and a lowering of corporate tax. That had a heck of a lot to do with it. Leonard goes on to say the following about this entire situation. The overall tax rate on the richest 400 households last year was only 23%, meaning that their combined tax payments equaled less than 1/4 of their income. This overall rate was 70% in 1950 and 47% in 1980. For middle class and poor families, the picture is different. Federal income taxes have also declined modestly for these families, but they haven't benefited much from it at all because the corporate tax and the state tax. And they now pay more in payroll taxes, which finance Medicare and Social Security, than in the past. Overall, their taxes have remained fairly flat. So, that's interesting to understand, but what is missing here? What you didn't hear about the middle class and poor families is this. Any numbers, anything that tells us what middle class taxes would be or the rate that they're paying. And again, they're relying on numbers of Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman. There's just a problem. That claim is pure bogus from the start. The claim that they only paid 23%. There are two things at work with why this claim is bogus. Let's just start with this. Saez and Zucman's own previous work proves the bogusness of this claim. Yes, in the 1950s, it was 70% and 47% in 1983. But virtually nobody paid it thanks to deductions, avoidance, and other such techniques available to the wealthy. We've talked about this in the past. This is called the effective tax rate. Between 1950 and 1959, the effective tax rate was actually 42%, not 70%. That happened due to what? Tax avoidance. As tax rates went up, income reporting went down. It's a near universal law of economics, my fine friends. Leonard acts as if this country was not founded on tax avoidance and a near rash-inducing allergy to taxes in general. But there's a second point here that actually happened in the Wall Street Journal just before me recording this show. Now, this comes from economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, and he sets the problem up this way. To see the problem, consider a simple thought experiment. Joe, a minimum wage employee, earns $15,000 a year. The government taxes Joe $1,000, then transfers him $600 so that he pays $400 on net. In another scenario, Joe pays $10,000 in taxes and collects $9,600 in transfer payments. Again, he pays $400 on net. But in the first scenario, Messrs. Saez and Zucman would report Joe's gross tax rate at a reasonable 6.7%, $1,000 over $15,000. In the second, they would call it an onerous 66.7%. The flaw in their method is even more obvious when you consider that American tax laws incorporate benefit subsystems and benefit laws incorporate tax subsystems. The federal personal income tax, for instance, includes the Earned Income Tax Credit, a major transfer program. The Social Security benefit system includes the earnings test, a major tax. If the focus is on gross taxes, should the EITC be excluded and Social Security's earnings test included? Economics can't say. What it does say is look past the language and measure net, not gross taxes. And that's the problem with this claim from the very start. This idea that they're paying 23% in taxes only talks about the net, the gross. So, do you see the problem here, right? Like Kotlikoff said, what it does say is look past the language and measure net, not gross taxes. The net tax is what matters here. And what you'll see is that by and large, for instance, let's say this, okay? Let's say that people get the earned income tax credit, okay? There are people in tax brackets that actually pay negative taxes on net. Not their gross taxes, on their net, based off of what they take in transfer payments, aka benefits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, like food stamps, like other programs that the government gives away in benefits, okay? You have to remember that. So while you're talking about, this whole idea, this whole Warren Buffett situation where I paid a lower tax rate than my secretary did. Well, sure, on its face, that might be true, right? If you're taking the gross tax rates. But what are other things that balance it out? And I think those are equally important when we're talking about this debate, okay? But let's go back to the plan that's being floated today by Elizabeth Warren, courtesy of Saez and Zucman. As the Tax Policy Center would point out, what would Warren do in this situation? She would tax net wealth defined as assets less liabilities in excess of $50 million at a rate of 2% and net wealth above $1 billion at 3%. She would include nearly every type of asset in her tax base, from the money in the bank to the very expensive jewels in the vault, publicly traded stocks and bonds, pensions, and the value of privately held family businesses also would be taxed. So, putting that in layman's language, your pension, your family farm, or that mom and pop restaurant, or the craft store, or whatever small family business that is making money could be nailed by this wealth tax on top of your own personal taxes that they might be included. It's just idiotic. If you look at it on its face, you're already being taxed on most of these things. Now, yes, it's true that some of these things, like large family businesses that are held privately, are taxed at a lower individual rate than they would be by a corporate tax, but at the same time, they're still paying taxes on it. You want them to pay even more tax on it? And then this one. Could we also just take a step back and think about this? How do you enforce this kind of a tax if you were to enact it? The IRS today can't even do the basics about its actual tax code as is. How do you know what business is with what family member? How do you know what assets that somebody might have, such as land that might be held in a private trust or might be held in an LLC? You could go on and on and on about this type of a situation, but they try to get around it. Leonard tries to argue about wealth inequality at this point. So I'm going to continue to educate the left here until I'm blue in the face. Wealth inequality. What he says is that there's a shrinking middle class in America, and it's due to wealth inequality. So please, bookmark this segment of the show. I'm going to put this up on the YouTube page. Again, you can find it at Critical Thinking with Andrew Coppens. Just type in Andrew Coppens on YouTube. Subscribe to the page. I'm going to put this up there for you. Okay? There are a few words that seem to not be understood by the left in America today. Upward mobility. I talked about this on a previous By the Number segment, but I want you to think about this. In 1967, just 8.1% of Americans earned $100,000 adjusted for 2016 dollars. So in 2016 dollars, just 8.1% of America earned $100,000. By 2016, that number has increased to 27.7%. At the same time, those households earning less than $35,000 has shrunk from 38.7% to 30%. That's a nearly 20% increase in the people going from not earning to earning $100,000 or more, and a nearly 8% decrease in the number of people earning under $35,000. Where did those people go? How did that happen? They've almost all done what? Moved upwards. That means that, yes, the middle class may be shrinking. The number of people in the middle might be shrinking. But what's happening is that the people that were on the upper end of that middle class stratosphere have moved into upper middle class, or even beyond that by now. The people that were at the bottom of the stratosphere have moved up, and they're not replacing the number of people that are moving upwards, right? The upward mobility here is insane. We're talking about nearly 30% of all of America has moved upwards in the last 50 years. In 50 years, we've nearly seen a 20% increase in $100,000 in earnings or more. Explain to me how people earning more money is a bad thing for the American economy, because that's the argument the left is trying to make here. Well, they don't want to tell you that people have been, by and large, upwardly mobile at a very healthy rate, when it comes to the pure dollars and cents. Now, does $100,000 go as far today as it did in 1967? Probably not, because inflation. But we've adjusted for 2016 dollars to give you these numbers. Now, Leonard tries another bite of the apple, and I'm sure you're going to hear this from Warren and company soon enough. That there's this whole idea that in colonial America, there was a wealth tax. So why can't we do it today? That's American after all. Now, they're sort of right, but the link that Leonard provides in his New York Times op-ed article kind of actually disproves what he's talking about. And here's why. Because the article links to the Hoover Institution's article that says the wealth tax in colonial America would be more akin to property tax today. Quote, the wealth tax was based on what was known as the country rate, which amounted to a property tax. Government officers carried out assessments, or sometimes the process involved self-assessment, subject to audit on the value of raw and improved lands, meadow, plowed, and hoed lands, goods, stock used in trading, boats and other vessels, mills, and other visible assets. Each year, the three units of colonial government, the province, the county, and the town or village, drew up a list of proposed expenditures. To support these governments, at a rate of tax was applied to the assessments to generate the requisite funds, resulting in a colonial rate, a county rate, and a town or village rate. I hate to break it to the left, we do not live in colonial times as a society. And I want to think about this as we talk about tax policy. So it's very clear that this was a property tax as we would put it today, right? If you own a boat, that's considered property. If you own a boat slip, that would be considered property. If you own a house or a condo or a townhome or a piece of land, that is considered property. Under Elizabeth Warren, would that be considered wealth? If so, you're paying double taxes on that because you already pay property tax to your local, your state, and your county. In some cases, you don't pay state, but you will pay to the local and the county. But there's another thing here, okay? There's another part of this tax argument that needs to be talked about. We do not live in colonial times. That was an agrarian society where having property was the biggest determinant of wealth at the time. Today, we live in a vastly different society. We live in a consumption-based society. We are, by and large, consumers versus producers. Okay? We consume things at a far greater rate than we produce them in America. So, I would argue that the better tax policy would be what? Consumption-based. So that would mean maybe if we apply a flat rate to people that earn, if you earn up to $30,000, you would be exempt from a consumption tax, or that you would pay it up front, but at the end of the year, you would get the money back, or whatever have you, right? You could just simply take a receipt or whatever. We can figure all of that out, but there would be a flat rate, okay? A flat consumption tax that would hit every single human being in America. Every single person would then have skin in the tax game, which is, for me, the ultimate goal here. Right now, the effective tax rate for a lot of people is negative. We need to get that into the positive so that everybody has some skin in the game and is paying attention to where the tax dollars are going. Now, finally, let's go ahead and examine this idea of the wealth tax constitutionally, which is, frankly, a novel concept for anybody in the leftist media. Now, thankfully, scholars have looked at this idea, and here's a shocker, they're rather divided on whether or not the wealth tax would be constitutional or not. Now, I want to take the example of the income tax as a great example of what could be happening with the wealth tax, okay? Now, if you didn't know this, the income tax that you and I are paying today is literally 100 years old today. And it required a constitutional amendment to even get there. The income tax first was floated in the late 1890s, but ruled unconstitutional. It was a law that they tried to pass, but the Supreme Court said, no, this is unconstitutional. So their way around that would be to do what? What the Founding Fathers believed we should be doing with the Constitution. Amend it. If you think that it's unconstitutional as written, amend the Constitution if you have the backing of the people. But it took them 20 years to get it passed as a constitutional amendment. So 1899 to 1919, folks. 20 years to get that tax passed as a constitutional amendment. So if you're ever wondering why the income tax exists in America, it's enshrined in our Constitution. It's also easily repealed, a la Prohibition repeal, a la all of the slavery stuff that was repealed in the Constitution. So as Americans, ideally, we could repeal it. But why does the story matter? Why am I telling you about the income tax? Because there is that bigger debate over the constitutionality of the wealth tax, as I was talking about before. Is the wealth tax a direct tax? That was what they ruled about the income tax, that it was a direct tax. Therefore, appropriations had to happen, which means proportionality. So it wasn't just that you and I individually would pay XYZ into, based off of our income. What it was saying is that based off of the population of the state would then have to administer the tax and pay it to the government. And that can't happen constitutionally. So they passed the amendment, right? The wealth tax would kind of work the same way in a lot of scholars' minds, okay? One side believes that the wealth tax falls under that direct tax clause and would not be constitutional as written, thus requiring the same amendment process that the income tax went through. The other side believes that the wealth tax is much more like the carriage tax of 1794, which I know to many of you is probably something that you don't understand or know about, but just think. Look this case up. Hilton versus the United States. Hylton. Hilton versus the United States, which gave us the fact that the carriage tax was not ruled a direct tax. Therefore, the government could institute it. Now, we're not sure, based off the scholarly information, which side would be correct. So the question at hand would be this for me. Do the Democrats have the stomach to fight for the wealth tax amendment, let alone enough states to support it? I say no, based off of what we saw during this debate on Tuesday night. Many people that were on that stage were hammering Elizabeth Warren over this idea of the wealth tax. But here's the deal. What Elizabeth Warren and her advocates are really advocating for is passing this as a law. They're banking on passing it as a law and winning in the court system. That's what they're banking on, my friends. They're not banking on having to make a constitutional amendment case. They're banking on winning the courts. And if you've been paying attention for the past 30, 40 years, what has the left been doing? They have been packing the courts with people who believe in the things that they believe in, think the way that they largely think, and they've been somehow able to get the vast majority of Republican presidents to put up liberal judges at the same point in time. So, what we have here is a situation where the judiciary and the legislative body are pretty much going to be in lockstep. That's what they're banking on here. Make no mistake about it. They're banking on the courts being packed in their favor. The good news, if you've been paying attention over the past couple of years, is that Donald Trump has done a really good job of filling the federal bench with staunch conservatives. At least people who would see this in a way that says, this looks like a direct tax, you cannot do it. So we're going to have an interesting situation on our hands should an Elizabeth Warren or somebody else in that socialist vein come across the finish line as the presidential candidate. With that being said, it's time for us to do what? Hit the pause button on this very episode of Critical Thinking. On the flip side, I'm going to be talking with Miley Smith of Illinois Policy about the Chicago Teachers Union strike and LeBron James saying, "Hold my beer" to the NBA and its China hypocrisy. Do not forget, you can follow me on social media at The Coppens Show, and we'll see you right back here on MoJo 50 Radio. Welcome back into Critical Thinking with your host with the most numbers, myself, Andrew Coppens, right here on MoJo 50 Radio. You can follow me on the social medias at The Coppens Show. That's COPPENS, COPPENS, for those of you who don't know. But I want to just say enough of all of that because it's time to bring in our guest for this week. It is a name familiar to those of you who have seen this show in the past. That is Miley Smith of Illinois Policy, illinoispolicy.org. And Miley, if you're here, that means one thing and one thing only. The Chicago teachers have gone on strike. So can you update us on the status of where we sit right now, heading into the weekend and everything that's going on?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So as you said, Chicago Teachers Union, which is an affiliate of the American Federation of Teachers, did go on strike. They've been on strike since Thursday, the 17th. And as we are in the weekend, we don't have a projected timeline for when kids will be back in school. We don't know what will happen on Monday. You know, I know that the Chicago Public Schools, that they have been discussing and trying to get negotiations to continue. But the Chicago Teachers Union has really been entrenched in their political demands. And you know, this strike really is all about political power. And that's in the union's own words. The AFT president, Randy Weingarten, was in town on Monday, and her quote was, we're about to teach the mayor a new lesson. Or, I'm sorry, we're about to teach the new mayor a lesson. And in the media, it's been widely speculated across Chicago media that this is about politics. And what we're seeing, it demonstrates that what we're seeing is a new type of teacher strike, new type of demand. They're striking over politics as opposed to those economic issues that we typically associate with collective bargaining.
And to that point, Miley, when we look at this, you know, we've talked enough about some of the details, but the latest proposal I've seen has been the 16% raise over 5 years. And we've seen a lot of the demands of the Chicago Teachers Union, at least on the economic side, totally met. Like they're not even saying that that's not something they want. So my question to you is, has there been a legal challenge? Should there be a legal challenge to this strike if it goes on beyond this weekend?
That certainly could be a viable action. There are some strikes that are illegal, and it's an illegal strike if they go out over certain subjects. And some of the things that CTU is on strike or claiming to be on strike about are staffing issues. They want more staff, like over 4,000 new staff members. They're asking for the creation of new community schools. They are asking for the board at Chicago Public Schools to advocate or lobby on behalf of certain subjects, like certain taxes and things like that. So those are typically things that are outside the scope of collective bargaining. There are things that Chicago Public Schools could negotiate with them over if they wanted, but they don't have to. And because of that, going out on strike over some of these tangential issues could make it an illegal strike. And you know, going back to the fact that this is a new type of strike, you know, they are demanding things, like I said, that are not typical to contract negotiations. And it really shows that not even a progressive mayor, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, so not even a progressive mayor who won an election by wide margins is safe. It demonstrates this massive power that unions have in Illinois and that they're pushing for more.
Yeah, you mentioned Mayor Lori Lightfoot here. Even on Friday morning, as she went in front of the cameras and talked about what was going down here, you noticed that she was talking about, we have no more money. That's becoming a new refrain for them as this situation unfolds further and further. They're just saying, hey, look, we're doing what we can to give you what you need financially. We just have no more money to do these extra things. So as we take a look at this, as the strike goes further and further, how do you see this playing out in terms of the PR war? Who really wins, if you will? Because I have a feeling the further this goes, the less and less the teachers are going to look like the the victims in all of this?
Yeah, in terms of PR, we certainly see CTU having less support from the media than they did in past strikes. We've seen the Sun-Times, which largely leans union-friendly, telling the teachers even before the strike to take the deal. And Lori Lightfoot has given them what they've wanted in terms of pay, really more. They were demanding 15% pay raises over 3 years, and she's offering them 16% pay raises over 5 years, and only 1% increase in health insurance premiums over the next 5 years. So she is giving them an incredibly generous deal. And when you compare what the average teacher gets versus what the average Chicago resident earns a year, it really demonstrates that the people that are going to pay the price for this are the residents. They're the parents. If you look at what the typical Chicago owner could see their property tax bill rising by at least $235 next year if CTU's demands were funded through property taxes. You compare that to what Lightfoot is offering, and their property taxes would only increase by about $13. So, this is really going to fall heavily on the residents of Chicago. And like you said, Chicago's not in a position to meet CTU's demands. They already have to borrow on a short-term basis just to meet day-to-day obligations. There's a junk credit rating. CPS's debt has quadrupled since 1998. So there really is no money. When Lightfoot says we don't have money to fund what you're demanding, it's the truth. Chicago doesn't have the money for this, and the residents are going to be the ones who really have the burden of paying for this. They don't have the money for it either.
And you mentioned the truth. Again, we're speaking with Miley Smith of Illinois Policy, illinoispolicy.org, at Illinois Policy on Twitter. You mentioned the truth. And so I'm going to ask you point blank, what is the truth in all of this matter? When we see that one side is saying that the other side is not negotiating in good faith, I tend to believe that I'm seeing a lot more good faith on behalf of CPS and the mayor than I am from the Chicago's teacher union, just based off of the rhetoric that we're seeing and what people are talking about in terms of the demands that are being placed upon CPS and the taxpayer ultimately. Where do you see the truth in all of this lie?
Sure. I think one of the easiest things to point to is the recommendation that was made by a neutral fact finder in the last couple of months. So CPS and CTU agreed to have a neutral party evaluate the proposals, the demands of both sides. Mm-hmm. And that fact finder based his recommendation on things like the district's financial ability to pay, the present and future general economic conditions, and what he, taking those considerations into factor, he recommended 16% pay raises over 5 years. He recommended a 1% increase in health insurance premiums over the next 5 years. And some of the things that CTU is demanding, like increased staffing, he noted were outside his jurisdiction to decide. The reason that's outside his jurisdiction is because under Illinois state law, it's called a permissive subject of bargaining. CPS doesn't have to bargain over it. So I think if you're looking for the truth, look at that fact finder's report. He was a neutral third party. He came back with a recommendation. That recommendation has been agreed to in full by Lori Lightfoot's administration, and CTU is rejecting it.
And this may come as a shock to you. Not everybody that's listening or watching this show is from Chicago or the greater Illinois state. So I want to bring this idea up to you. For me, I've harped on this for a while. In fact, back in January, before I even had this show, and I was just doing By the Numbers, a 2-minute segment here on MoJo 50 Radio, I kept track of what was going on with the teachers union strike that was happening in Los Angeles. And I'm looking back at that rhetoric. I see a lot of very big similarities to this. So how important do you think it is for people that are not necessarily in Chicago or Illinois to pay attention to what's going on here? Because my theory, my working theory here is that this is what's coming to a town, a village, a city near you during the next few contract negotiations in your town, because it seems like this is a national thing from the American Federation of Teachers or whatever teachers union on the national level. This seems to be a national fight that they want to bring to municipalities.
That's right. I would totally agree with that. And I would point to, again, the fact that we have a progressive mayor, the first African-American mayor, female mayor in Chicago, who, for all intents and purposes, probably agrees with the majority of CTU members on political issues. Mm-hmm. And if this can happen, if a teachers union can make these outrageous demands and really be a thorn in the side of a progressive mayor in a city like Chicago, then it certainly could happen anywhere in the United States. And, I would also point out that you're not safe either if strikes are illegal in your state. I say this because, in Illinois is a bit of an outlier when it comes to allowing teacher strikes. None of our neighbors, our neighboring states allow teacher strikes, and teacher strikes are illegal in 8 of the top 10 largest school districts. And of course, Chicago is one of those where it is legal. And I mentioned this because just because it's illegal in your state doesn't mean it won't happen. Look at what is happening with CTU. We've already mentioned that some of their demands, like staffing and the increased number of schools, those are things that it is illegal to go on strike over. And yet they're ignoring the legality and going on strike anyway.
And to that point, I think how they're getting around this, and we talked about this earlier, is that they're not saying yes to anything that's on the table, whether that's contractual, monetary issues or anything, because the second that they agree to that specific proposal, the economic side of it is suddenly off the table. They cannot strike. They would not be able to, in my view. But to your larger point here, when we're talking about some of the more contentious issues, and I want people to listen to this, what is one of the, I would say maybe what are the top 3 most outrageous demands that are being made in this negotiation by the teachers union?
Well, I mean, it's hard to narrow it down to 3 because there are so many demands that would be outrageous, I think, to the average person. But a few that come to mind are, one of the demands is that they want the city of Chicago and the Chicago public schools to help new teachers buy homes. They want them to take a stance and assist with affordable housing. They want a moratorium on school closures for the next 10 years. So first of all, 10 years goes beyond the scope of the contract. CPS is wanting a 5-year contract. CTU is wanting a 3-year contract. And CTU is also wanting a 10-year moratorium on the closure of schools. The second thing I would say about that is that is regardless of student population. And we know that student population has been declining. So it doesn't make sense to demand a moratorium on school closings when student population could go down during that time period. And another thing that I already alluded to is that they want, the union wants the public schools, Chicago public schools, to advocate for policies like a millionaire's tax and rent control. So what you see is the union dictating exactly what issues and what stance the Chicago Board of Education is supposed to be taking in legislative type issues.
I mean, those are mind-boggling to the average American, I think. Not surprising when you take a look at the Chicago Teachers Union and the fact that, I mean, this summer they literally went to Venezuela and basically had a propaganda episode for Nicolas Maduro and his wonderful thugs in Venezuela. That's how radical this group is. It wasn't just a small subsect of teachers going there. These were people that were involved with the board of directors, the board of the Chicago Teachers Union. So just keep that in mind, America. But Miley, as we come out of this weekend, what is your prediction for where this goes next?
Well, as of right now, we have no word on how long this strike will take. But as you mentioned, CTU does not seem to be negotiating. It is not compromising, as opposed to what we're seeing from Chicago public schools. And at this point, there's really no prediction in terms of how long this could last. But what we do know is that it is harmful to the students. We know that academic outcomes are affected by time off of school from strikes. And the longer this goes, the more it's going to harm the students. And that's what the school system is supposed to be all about.
No doubt about it. Well, Miley, thank you so much for joining us here on the show. How can people follow your work, and what do you have coming down the pipeline for yourself and at Illinois Policy?
Well, right now they can look online at illinoispolicy.org, illinoispolicy.org. That's where they can track our work. We certainly have had a number of blog posts about this strike and other issues, but we are in Illinois, so there are always issues coming down the pipeline. We know, looking forward to 2020, there is going to be a progressive tax hike on the ballot, a constitutional amendment. So that, besides teacher strikes and union issues, that's another issue that we are incredibly involved with and will be watching in the next year.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here, and I'm sure we'll be talking as 2020 unfolds.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Miley Smith of Illinois Policy, thank you so much to her for joining us, and thank you to illinoispolicy.org and all the people working there to help facilitate bringing her on. I really, really appreciate that. But we have got a couple of topics left here on the show. Believe it or not, we still have a few things to talk about. But before I get into one of the topics of the day that everybody wanted to know about and hear about, I've got to address one thing that happened here on MoJo 50 Radio this week, and that is the ending of the By the Numbers segment. That's right, By the Numbers is no longer airing on MoJo 50 Radio. And I wanted to clear two things up. The first thing, obviously, I'm still here on MoJo 50 Radio with the weekly radio show. So that means I'm not upset at all with MoJo 50 Radio. They're not upset with me. Nothing happened there. The second thing is, why is By the Numbers no longer airing on the radio? Well, it's just this. I've got only so many hours in a day to devote to work. And unfortunately, my 9-to-5 job has become more like a 9-to-9 job at times. And I've got other feet in the fire with different things, whether it be this show, bringing it to you each and every week, and other things going on. And ultimately, there are too many feet in the fire. That means something has got to give, and that is what gave. So it's just that simple. I needed to reclaim some time for myself. Burning the midnight oil, I want to give you the sharpest show possible, and that was becoming impossible. Burning that midnight oil over and over again. I do not want to burn myself out, and most importantly, I want to make sure that I actually have a life outside of all of the work that I do for you and that I do for myself. So with that being said, don't fret, don't worry, all of you By the Numbers fans. You'll still hear a lot of talk about the numbers, and more importantly, By the Numbers was kind of the impetus for the start of this show to begin with. So this show is a byproduct of By the Numbers. If you were a fan of By the Numbers, tune into the show, hit the subscribe button on the YouTube page or on iHeartRadio or whatever podcasting app you would like. Subscribe. Don't miss an episode. And hopefully there's greater things to come for this show down the road. With that being said, we have got to talk about news of the day. And one of the biggest topics this week, LeBron James, in his discussion of the NBA, China, and Daryl Morley's tweet about China. Now, you would think the story would go away, right? I mean, after all, the NBA got to China, had some snafus there, had some issues. Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, attempted to deal with them. But this is the wokest of the woke sports leagues in America, and that means their mouths are not going to stay silent. In the words of Laura Ingraham, LeBron James and company not going to shut up and dribble. And in this case, LeBron James should have just shut up. He should have just said, hey, look, I don't know enough about this situation. Instead, what he pointed out to us was exactly what I told you last week. The NBA's move in China in their reaction to Daryl Morley's tweet was all about craven capitalism. There's a difference between being a capitalist and making sure that you can care about humanity and what the NBA is doing here. The NBA is straight up going for a cash grab. LeBron James proved it this week. What did he do? Well, first he decided to say this. And then he decided to tweet out that, oh, I wasn't talking about the content of what Daryl Morley had to say, just that there could have been a better time to have said it. So all that LeBron James is saying here is, oh, that's right. I don't care about anything other than the bottom dollar. Now, remember back to the start of the show when I said inequality anywhere is a threat to equality everywhere? That was a tweet that LeBron James put out. That is a quote, no less, of Martin Luther King Jr. saying that inequality anywhere is a threat to equality everywhere. So what could be more unequal than human rights abuses of China right now? Right now, there's 1 million Uyghurs, Muslim people who have lived in that land for thousands of years at this point, for at least 1,800 years. And they've been Muslim largely for roughly 600 to 800 years, depending on your look at history. Okay? These people are historic to the region that they live in. China is persecuting them for their religious beliefs. And it's not just persecution, it is flat out murdering them. They are looking to wipe the Uyghur population off of the face of the earth, because if they do that, that's one less religious sect that they have to worry about. And don't you forget about this. The socialist, aka the Communist Party of China, do not like religion, just like any socialist would, just like any good communist wouldn't like religion. So this is what this is all about, eliminating religious belief, because once you have religious belief, you have free thought, especially against a Chinese party that advocates for collectivism and no free thought. So it's a danger to the Communist Party for that to happen. But they're not just going after them. They're putting them in concentration camps. They're starving them. They're putting them through 10 hours of re-education every day, whatever that means. Now, if you're a student of history, this sounds awfully like the Nazi Party of 1933 through 1941. They were just re-education camps. All that they were doing was working them to death, starving them to death, doing all the things other than the gas chambers. Could that be coming next for the Uyghurs? Where's LeBron James, who's supposed to be this social justice warrior, standing up for the rights of human beings to have religious beliefs? Where's LeBron James saying killing people simply because of their religious belief? Not cool. You had an opportunity with the NBA being in China to actually put into practice what you preach to us every single day. You continuously tell us about the inequalities of the United States of America and how terrible this country is. Yet at the same point in time, when rubber meets the road with true, utter, undisputed human rights abuses, you stay silent just so you can protect $1 billion bankroll for you and your fellow players? Now, I also want to make this clear. Daryl Morley is not some virtuous person here. He's not somebody who did the good thing and stood the good fight. Let's not forget that he backed down the second there was backlash from the Houston Rockets and the NBA. What did he do? He deleted the tweet. Now, of course, that had a lot to do with pissing off China and all of those things. But ever since then, Where has Daryl Morley been about talking about this subject? He's been nowhere to be found. I want you to think about that. Daryl Morley has been nowhere to be found on this subject anymore. He's been effectively silenced by the NBA. If Daryl Morley truly believed what he said about Hong Kong, right, and the fight for democratic freedom, if LeBron James believes in the freedom of speech and the things that he claims to believe in, why not take the opportunity when the stage is the biggest to stand up and say something about it, to do something, to act instead of just gab, gab, gab? None of these people did it. Sending out a tweet about your advocacy for a specific issue does nothing unless you can back it up with physical action or money donated to the cause. Now, maybe Daryl Morley has donated to the cause and just hasn't said anything publicly. That's definitely possible. At the same point in time, there are such things as universal American values. And one of those values is freedom and democracy. Now, we have also had an entire, almost 20 years of history here to tell us that spreading democracy by force doesn't necessarily work. The people have to demand democracy, want democracy, have a history of understanding what democracy and parliamentary procedures and all of those things look like. Hong Kong is a perfect example of a place that we should be advocating for freedom for. They had that experience with their rule under the British. They understand the autonomy of democracy. They understand what it takes to build a society off of democracy. They're craving for it. They're asking America for your help. Instead, LeBron James puts his boot on their throat and says, nah, I'm going to take the millions or billions of dollars from China over doing the right thing. And that's the problem that I ultimately have with all of this. These people, they talk a big game on the little stuff. When it really matters, when you've got to have skin in the game to care about it, right? When you may face arrest or negative consequences. What does LeBron James say? Well, guess what? If there's negative consequences, maybe you shouldn't say anything. You could have waited a week. I'm sorry that was an inconvenient time for you. But this isn't a universal American value. Stand up for it. It's not that difficult. Really, LeBron James, it is not that difficult. It's just that simple. All right, folks, on that note, it looks like we're about finished here on Critical Thinking for this weekend, October 19th, year of our Lord, 2019. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Miley Smith at Illinois Policy on Twitter, illinoispolicy.org. Coming up next, Matthew Holloway in the HollowNet program. Until next week, be safe, be smart, and keep on being the amazing people you are.